Hello everyone, I'm Maria Battista, and I thought I would show you my studio today and give you an idea of how it is that I do my work. I'm a sculptor and also a goldsmith, and in the realm of sculpture I do two different media. I make bronze classical figures and I carve stone. What I find is that most people are very curious about how the stone carving takes place and really have no idea how that is possible. We don't have quite as much of a tradition of that in the United States as they do in Europe. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about how a stone carving takes place. Usually you start with an amorphous block of stone. It might be a rectangle block that's been carved out of a mountain, or maybe it'll be a little bit more organic. I don't personally believe the old adage about the figure being in the stone and you simply need to find it. Usually if you have a rectangular block, it doesn't look like anything until you start carving it. So the first step is the creative process of making a model of what it is that you want to carve. This is a clay model, it's called a maquette, of what I'm going to be doing with this green stone, which is called Verde Cristina. It comes from Italy. It's a very, very hard stone, the hardest one I've ever carved. And in this case, my model is 1-to-1 ratio, so I've got it pretty easy. I just need to use my calipers to take measurements off of my model and compare them to the stone that I'm carving to make sure I'm not removing too much material. So how do you do it? How do you start? The first step is usually a grinder. And as you can see, it has a diamond blade on it, which will cut through most of the hard stones that I work with. And it has no safety attached to it, because if it had the safety hood, it would be impossible to get in and carve the stone the way you need to. So in my case, I like to wear chainsaw pants when I do this, because I did actually have a very bad accident years ago that taught me to be a little safer about how I operate. So in the old days, they would just chisel at stone and break off large pieces in the beginning, but the grinder makes much shorter work of it for the modern sculptor. After that stage, one would probably move to using air hammers. And these pneumatic hammers are beautiful little mechanisms. These particular ones are called coturis and they come from Italy. And I attach them to my air hose. And then there's a particular kind of chisel that's used with them, the carbide chisel, that is tempered in such a way that the back will not mushroom when it's inserted into the hammer. So some chisels can be struck with an actual hammer. These cannot. They can only be used with the air hammer. And you insert it while the hammer is moving. Once it's on, it kind of feels like a little jackhammer in your hand, and it's delivering the blows so that I don't need to be swinging a hammer. And one can actually sort of draw in the stone. Once you become a little experienced, it really becomes a very beautiful action of three-dimensional drawing. We use generally 3 kinds of chisels in that process. There's a chisel called an unghietto in Italian, which means fingernail. I hope you can see that. And that is for removing material, creating concavities. The fork chisel is a little bit more for refining the surface of planes and defining planes better. And then maybe toward the end you'd be using some flat chisels to clean up the surfaces and get it close to the stage where you're ready to polish. There may be little nooks and crannies that you want to get to that it's hard to do with either the chisel or the grinder, and then one would perhaps use an air grinder with different shapes of these green stone wheels for the grinding process. So getting like up in here and around the face would be much easier done with a grinding material. Then, once you have the shape that you want, and I'm pretty close to it on this piece, there's still a little bit more carving I need to do, you might move to using rasps. And the rasps are various shapes and sizes, and they will fix the planes. If you have any irregularities in the planes, you go over them with a rasp and you create a nice smooth surface that you're then ready to polish. And the polishing may sound like the easy stage, but actually I find that it's the stage that takes the longest in a stone sculpture. It's done by hand usually, with various grits of silicon carbide emery paper. Can be used wet or dry. Usually starting with 36 or 60 grit and working your way all the way up to at least 250 or 400, sometimes even beyond to 2,000 or 5,000. So this is, as you can imagine, extremely painstaking and time-consuming, but also a pleasure. One of the tools we have that makes it a little easier is some diamond sponges that can be used wet or dry as well. And for flat surfaces, these are particularly helpful. Now, if one is making a more representational piece such as this one, which is a portrait, one really needs to do that in the old-fashioned way that the old masters did, with hammer and chisel. As I said before, you can't use the same chisels that you use for the air hammer. You would use regular steel chisels, which are tempered in such a way that one can strike them with a hammer. And that way, the work is very slow and careful. Obviously with stone, once you take it off, you can't put it back on. So you want to make sure that you're not making errors that will later ruin your piece. So with a face and all the detail that one's doing of the planes and volumes of a face, you definitely would simply be going after this gently with hand chisels and your own strength. So today I'm working on a particular project that I'd like to show you. I'm going to go put on all of my protective gear, the rest of it, I've got some of it on now, and show you what I'm doing with a piece of Colorado marble.